So this is how a forest is defined ecologically. Here the forest is seen as a functional unit or system. Of course, we know the definition. It is an interrelationship between the biotic and the abiotic components. A forest ecosystem is also characterized as being large and complex. It has a greater species diversity, high levels of stratification, that is a vertical distribution of species. And I think some important functional aspects of a forest that one needs to then emphasize are productivity, energy flows, decomposition and nutrient cycling, and also some of the ecological services that a forest provides, such as it helps in the generation of productive soils, groundwater percolation, climate regulation, and the provision of clean water. Right? So these things are important when one defines or looks at a forest scientifically, which is a much broader and a deeper understanding of a forest as opposed to its popular definition. A forest, therefore, is much more than the sum of its parts. It's not just the trees that constitute the forest. It is many of these functions and how it functions as a system that makes it a forest. Now let's look at some of the legal definitions of the forest and compare them to the previous two. So in the Indian Forest Act, the forest is defined as an area occupied by the government for the conservation management of ecological and biological resources. So this was, the Indian Forest Act was framed during the colonial times, and therefore the emphasis on management of ecological resources, because that's when the forests were used for resource extraction and exploitation. The Forest Conservation Act of 1980, similarly again it defines forest land as reserve forest or protected forest. These two, the reserve forest and protected forest, are actually categories which are defined under the Indian Forest Act. So the Forest Conservation Act defines it as either reserve forest or protected forest, or any other area recorded as forest under government records regardless of ownership. Right? So in fact there was a recognition in the Forest Conservation Act of 1980 of what was known as deemed forest. Deemed forest, according to a Supreme Court judgment, referred to forest-like areas not formally classified by central or state authorities in official records. So there were also other areas which were not necessarily classified by forest or not under the forest department, which would be deemed forest as per the Supreme Court order. So any area in a sense which had standing forest or what would constitute a forest would be defined as that. This category, however, I think Debbie was talking about the recent dilution of the Forest Conservation Act in December 2023 via an amendment. This category of deemed forest has been struck out from the Forest Conservation Act, if I'm correct. Okay, so now why are we looking at categories, and are these categories important? What are the, when we compare different categories, again the forest is defined differently in each of these categories. However, I would like to emphasize and argue that each of these above categories has a place and a purpose. However, we need to be very conscious and clear regarding the definitions and which of the three categories we are using when we speak of the term forest. Now I would like to speak, this was just the background, I'd like to now emphasize a work that we did, I think a few years ago. It was titled the Mapping RA Study. And this was a study of land use, land cover change and the impact of land use, land cover change in the catchment areas and ecosystems of RA. The area covered by RA milk colony. Now, one of the reasons why we took up this study, actually it was really something that we decided to do, because there was an ongoing debate amongst environmentalists and activists at that time about, is RA a forest? Because some of the environmentalists were classifying RA as a forest, and then there were others who were trying to oppose the metro car shed, because the metro car shed had a lot of trees or tree cover which was being disturbed. And we felt that it was important to also understand the ecology beyond the narrow categories of trees and forest, and that was one of the things that we mapping RA report. So what we wanted to argue was that in the report was that actually, in fact, a watershed of the Dahisar and the Mithi rivers, and any kind of deep impact on the ecosystems in RA would have downstream impacts, which would exacerbate flooding in the downstream areas of these catchments. We also emphasized that RA comprised of diverse ecosystems. It was not, so I would like to emphasize again here that, in fact, if you look at either of the three definitions of forest, the popular ecosystems scientific definition or the legal definition, as per none of these definitions, RA classifies as a forest. Because, in fact, recently it does, because I think in 2021, Aditya Thackeray designated a strip of land within RA as reserve forest. But before that, when we did the report, the entire RA mill colony was not classified as a forest. It was classified as NDZ in the earlier 1991 development plan. The other important aspect also was that even if you look at as a dense growth of trees, not all of RA has dense tree cover. The scientific definition of the forest as an ecosystem, that what we have argued in the mapping RA report, has a range of ecosystems ranging from bodies, and not all of it necessarily falls under the scientific definition, right? So now to come to my next point is that we also, however, highlighted that RA was within the buffer zone. Large parts of it are designated as protected and reserve forests, but RA, however, legally falls into the buffer zone. And we wanted to highlight in the report what we've done. We've tried to highlight the significance of the ecological or a corridor for the movement of wildlife, because there is wildlife from SGNP that also moves through these varied ecosystems in RA, and RA therefore being a buffer zone to the national park needed to be conserved. So there are different arguments put out for the conservation of RA, which all either being legally defined as a forest or trees. Environmental conservation is often scoffed at by certain commentators, especially by academics, because environmentalists are generally considered as exclusionary or anti-people, often in reference to the origin of these environmental conservation laws, right? And it is true that some of these laws, like the Indian Forest Act, were enacted during the colonial period, that the extraction of resources and the deprivation of taking away resources from communities. However, over time, have also been critiqued and examined, and they have now been broadened to look beyond this approach of isolation to include larger landscapes where human and nature also coexist. And therefore, the map case for broadening and strengthening environmental planning and regulation.
Thanks for bringing in this broader idea of ecosystems and the ecological framework which goes beyond forest and the house of trees, and I think the various ecosystems that exist in which humans are just part of it. We'll be coming to the last speaker, Hussein, who will be talking about the broader concept of like how does one talk about nature in city, and I think Malini had touched about the aspect of property, and I think where land use and property they might link.
Perhaps. Thank you so much for inviting me. So I thought that maybe for instance, the RA already mentioned that we have done a study on RA. And the RA controversy began mainly when the RA was identified as one of the areas for the metro construction of the metro car shed. This was in the DPR of the Metro Line 3. In 2011, I think it was released, and that time there was some bit of talk about it. What's interesting about that report is that it had identified 9 possible sites for the car shed. One of them was, of course, Bandapulla complex. It was also Mahalakshmi race course, but Bandapulla complex was in the same report recognized as the most viable option because it's public land. MMRD is the planning authority for the metro line. It's vacant, no land acquisition issues, and so on. However, it said we will not build it there because the economic value of land is too much. BKC is reclaimed land. The environmental destruction is already done. So ideally, it should have been the option chosen, but it was not chosen, and RA was chosen as the site. So further environmental degradation for a project where the same thing could have been built easily somewhere else. Anyway, so that was a little bit of the background. The other time where the RA controversy erupted was when the first draft of the development plan was released in 2014, and RA was recognized as an economic growth sector. And that map of RA with the, I think Malini would remember that, the blue color saying that this is an economic growth hub or something like that, became a huge issue, and it got a lot of attention. Well, in any case, when the construction of the car shed began, that's when in 2018 we we thought we should look at it because, as I mentioned, there was a debate about whether it's a forest or not, the tree cutting and so on. So the report study was a kind of a conceptual and academic intervention, but it was meant for the public, but it was also meant to understand RA outside the framing of RA as a forest or a non-forest. In activist debates, this forest-non-forest dualism is a common theme. It would seem that there are two sides pitted against one another. On the one side, there are those who seek to destroy the forest for their own interest, and there are those who seek to defend it in their own interest. On the one side is the demonic state and market nexus and the demonized slum dwellers, and on the other side is the romantic environmentalist and the romanticized Adivasi. Then there's another dualism, which is very common in academia, which is between the middle class environmentalists and the urban poor. The middle class environmentalists who hypocritically claim to be saviors of the environment and who look at the poor as the destroyers of the environment. And they perceive the poor as encroachers and so on, or they are basically misled beneficiaries of slumlords. It's also sometimes assumed that by environmentalists that sometimes, if they are sensitive, they recognize that there are people who live within the forest and who live with nature or close to nature, who may have some rights to the forest, but not so much anybody else. Now, these debates, these dualisms amongst activists and academics, they're fairly sterile, and both need to be challenged, both at a conceptual level as well as at an analytical level. So at the conceptual level, the problem is that the environment is assumed to be certain features of the urban sphere which get undisturbed by human action. They are those clearly legible aspects of the natural world set apart from human activity. And the forest in the city is another way of saying nature in the city. And the people who live in the forest are then, therefore, people who live within or close to nature. Even in the environment, among environmental activists, the idea is that environmental conservation is about protecting these remaining patches of nature, in the forests and rivers and mangroves and so on. So the compartmentalization of the city and the forest, or the environment and people, are unhelpful for both political or academic debates. We need, what we thought was we need a richer conceptual vocabulary to be able to think about the forms and consequences of the human transformation of the physical environment. Even at the empirical level, this compartmentalization is unhelpful. So, for example, what is the environment for the city is going to service? It is often, the environment is often poorly serviced neighborhoods, absence of basic amenities, hazardous living conditions, poor access to infrastructure networks. Struggles for better housing, for better conditions, for better public goods are implicitly, if not explicitly, environmental struggles. The city is being transformed all the time, not just in RA but everywhere. And there are net gainers and net losers in this process. The environmental analysis, our environmental analysis, therefore, ought to be about how the benefits and burdens of environmental transformation are distributed. And environmental struggles ought to be about how to deploy the tools of planning, conservation, regulation, redistribution towards social and environmental equity. And so when we decided to look at the RA colony, we began not with the question of forest and non-forest, but with the question of how we can understand the social and ecological value of this sizable piece of public land in the heart of the city. It has an important function in the city's economy as a mill colony. It provides ecosystem services to the city in terms of its forest cover and permeable land. It is a source of livelihood and residence for a variety of groups, Adivasis, foragers, squatters, dairy workers. And therefore it has value not just for people who live within RA, but also the city as a whole. What I want to argue is that we need broad regulatory frameworks for the conservation and protection of livelihoods and environmental resources. For this, we need to have analytical frameworks that provide the conceptual ground for such regulations. And we need to understand the intertwined interests of those who live and work in many of these areas that we call whether forest or not forest. So to conclude, I would also like to caution against the idealized view that there is a view of the forest from the city, and then there is an alternative view of the city from the forest. This is an attractive idea, and it evokes the old trope of tradition and modernity. Nevertheless, we shouldn't miss the fact that there are divergent views of the forest from the city, just as there are divergent views of the city from the forest. And our goal ought to be to try to connect the progressive views of the forest from the city and the progressive views of the city from the forest and bring them together into a common environmental movement. Thank you.
Thank you. I think lots of food for thought, and while we are still trying to grapple with and trying to absorb like the sort of just not like information but more than the insights and the knowledge किया है, तो I think time को थोड़ा ध्यान रखते हुए we'll directly go into questions from the audiences. तो just एक हाउस रूल रहेगा कि जो भी सवाल पूछना चाहें, जिनके पास सवाल है अपना हाथ उठा सकते हैं, and then किसी एक पर्टिकुलर स्पीकर के बारे में क्वेश्चन है उसका नाम लिखकर क्वेश्चन आ रहे हैं. Also be brief for it.
Myself Prashant, that you mentioned that in Goa almost 80% land is reserved for as a green zone. So if it is possible in Goa, why other parts of country? I have curiosity about that. What was issue involved there and who contributed in that program?
I think that we can add.
Sure. Regional plan, it was a struggle. Actually, there was a plan, 2007, 2000. The regional plan was actually scrapped through a citizens' protest, a large movement. So this plan, which replaced that scrapped plan, came out through a task force that and there was a very strong citizens movement. The Goa Bachao Andolan was part of this new plan that came up. So the plan which was scrapped had painted all of Goa red. It was opened for development. Asked about the plan in the first place, because It doesn't have, Goa doesn't have it did not have a very high growth rate. There was no reason for suddenly half of Goa to be opened up. So there was, there was a very active mobilization of people against that plan. So that was the first thing. The second thing, industry is, it was a huge tourism industry. So there was a coming together of the environmental and the tourist interest. So it was a special case in that it also promoted the tourist interest. It aligned quite well. So yeah.
Hi, thanks a lot for this panel. So my question is actually more to Hussein and also correctly. So the idea of you talking about city from forest and forest from city, in a way it's a very interesting idea because it kind of breaks this whole dualism, right? In a way that there is some, the forest is not just one homogeneous entity or city is not just one homogeneous entity, but I'm trying to understand more in the empirical terms that when it comes to representing guidelines or regulatory framework, often when state is pitted against activists and stuff, the defining thing or what they want is more black and white. Either we want it or we don't want it, rather than discussing these grays. So I understand there is that analytical framework you're talking about in a more theoretical sense, but I'm trying to throw more light on if that has to be implemented in the form of defined guidelines to understand this non-dualistic approach of forest and city. So it can help me frame certain more practical sense to this theoretical idea you're talking about, because it's kind of, I'm also very curious in terms of the tech or the mapping. So like those certain acres were lost when you actually projected. So if that has to apply on mapping or certain practical guidelines, how will that translate towards that? Broadly.
Yeah. If there is any related question, someone want to add to the question? Yeah.
I mean, just to give an example, you mentioned that there could be some examples of this. For instance, if you look at the CRZ regulation, what did it do? Of course, it had, generally all of the laws. But the idea was that there are different kinds of areas which need different kinds of protections. And while such a recognition is there, you have different kinds of uses and so on. So certain uses are permitted, certain uses are not permitted. If within those permitted uses, there are certain guidelines which need to apply and bylaws that need to apply and so on. So essentially, when you talk about planning, you would think about trying to understand the of different areas in the city and in the region, and thinking about, okay, what kind of frameworks would you need to protect what is important to protect and then to allow what is important to allow, right? So that is how it would translate into laws. Obviously this is difficult because it's easier to just say, okay, nobody should enter, nobody should exit, nobody should live here, this is protection. And then you have everything else which is free of all kinds of protection. Right? So that is generally the conservation debate that even Gitanjoy was referring to, the exclusionary conservation.
Yeah, so for example, the maps that the MRD produces or the DMC, they have been very rigid for a very long time. But there are also alternate sort of maps that exist that that kind of claim. For example, we spoke about the Forest Rights Act and the claims that we make on the land, right? So there is a set of maps called Nazari, which are essentially a map that is prepared by officials based on the account of the residents there. So that's it's more to do with that tree or that farm, that stream, etc. Right? And those are and there is space for both of these to coexist. Crowdsourcing of this data is not something that's really unimaginable, because if you think about it, most of the cities sort of in informal traffic regulation plans, it happens based on data collected by Google, right? And the traffic that's kind of generated. We plan our movement based on that. We trust data and we don't delegitimize it, right, at all. I to imagine such a situation even in mapping exercises of a formal nature into the fold, crowdsourcing a lot of information. Exactly, I think it was called the development plan there. It more seasons when there isn't any crops, you are allowed to perform certain. So the development plan plot of land for reservation. So that's a fluid sort of imagination of the map. Okay. So there are these ways on us to start identifying the sort of pathway, especially in this context. But I think there's definitely scope.
So it was very interesting that in the 2000 RA, a large part of RA, if I'm not mistaken, was mapped as an area for primary activity. Sorry, right? And in fact, many of the lands which were used by the fisher folk also for their fish drying areas, etc., fishing and ancillary activities, are shown as areas reserved, as primary activities in the development plan. Now it was interesting that this did not translate in the case of RA into the proposed development plan for various reasons, right? However, I think that there can be categories like so it was interesting because RA was never a forest. It was not. It was an NDZ. It was never an SGMP. But the team that prepared the development plan for Bombay, the ELU survey, they had noted that that area was largely a dairy, and there were existing Adivasi padas in RA. And so the entire area has been marked as an area reserved for primary activities. So I think this was a first step. To also respond to Ankush, there was a wide a kind of citizens campaign. So it was not just UDRI putting up the maps. There was actually Hamara was a part of it, and all of us were a part of it. So at that time we had visited every almost many fishing villages. I met Prakash Goyal for the first time, and we did have a meeting with the BNC and the Ex-South representatives from, I think more than 200 or 300 representatives from the urban villages in Bombay who were actually arguing for the mapping. So I think that this exercise did take place, and there was a possibility of that happening with the 2014 plan. However, unfortunately, that plan was scrapped, and then they came up with another version. And all the efforts that had taken place through citizens' efforts were futile. So it's not that it did not happen for Mumbai. It's just that I think the influence in determining what eventually happened here.
I think प्रकाश के अगर आप इसके बारे में कि शहर को शहर से देखना इसके बारे में अगर कुछ या आप कैसे देखते हैं?
मैंने देखा है ना कि मैं बचपन में छोटा था, अभी तो मैं छोटा था, तो मैं अभी देख रहा हूँ वहाँ पे मजाज डेपो है, वहाँ पे बहुत बड़ा तालाब था। मैं और मेरे पिताजी हम लोग जाते थे वहाँ पे, मच्छी पकड़ते थे, और मेरी माँ मच्छी बेचने जाती थी। और जहाँ पे ग्रीन फील्ड इमारतें है या फिर नमस्कार करती बिल्डिंग है, जितनी ऊंची बिल्डिंग है उतने बड़े पहाड़ हुआ करते थे, वो पहाड़ सब काट दिए और वहाँ पे अभी बिल्डिंगें हैं उतनी बड़ी। और फिर अभी जो जेवेलर रोड जो है वहाँ पे लोग डरते थे। हम लोग शहर के ओर जंगल में जाते थे लकड़ियाँ चुनने या फिर कुछ बेर या कुछ फल या बारिश में जो सब्जियाँ उगती थी, तो वहाँ पे अभी सब शहर सा हो गया है। मैंने देखा है कि जंगल ऑटोमेटिकली कुछ सालों के बाद शहर में बदल गया, लेकिन मैं यही देखना चाहता हूँ कि शहर, मैं एक बार गया था वहां पे, तो शहर था, अभी वहां पे जंगल बन गया। तो मुझे लगता है ये भी तो विकास है। आगे जाके हमें जरूरत होगी कि ज्यादा से ज्यादा पेड़ भी होने चाहिए, जंगल भी होने चाहिए। अरे सिटी होती गई तो हम लोग बचेंगे कैसे? अभी यहाँ ऑक्सीजन का जो रेट हमने जो कोरोना में देखा, तभी हमें पता चला कि कितना महंगा है ऑक्सीजन, और हमें तो फ्री में मिल रहा है ना, हमें उसको वैल्यू नहीं है। तो इसी तरह अगर होता रहा तो जो हम लोग सोचते हैं ना हमारे बच्चों के लिए हम कुछ बैंक बैलेंस रखेंगे, तो सब बैंक बैलेंस खाली हो जाएगा ऑक्सीजन लेने के। तो हमें लगता है कि ऑक्सीजन बैलेंस भी रखना चाहिए हमारे बच्चों के लिए। तो ये सब मैं भाग्यशाली हूँ कि मैं ये सब देखा वो सब, लेकिन मेरे बच्चे शायद वो नहीं देखेंगे। मेरे बच्चे ने तो अभी देखा है, लेकिन मेरे पोती जो है वो भी करके वो शायद नहीं देखेंगे। तो ये सब हमें कंट्रोल करना चाहिए। और मुझे लगता है कि मेरे मैंने गाने में लिखा है, जो गाने भी मैंने हमारी जो परिस्थिति देख के बनाए हैं, उसमें मराठी गाना है, आपको शायद थोड़ा सा समझ में नहीं आएगा कुछ लोगों को। तो उसमें लिखा है कि कळली ही नाही जाना या निसर्गाची महती, हिरवा देव म्हणती ज्याला हे आदिवासी, हिरवाई वाचवाया तू धावर, हिरवाई वाचवाया तू धावर, वाघ देवा जंगल वाचवाया तू धावर, पर्यावरणाचा सत्यानाश केला, वाघ देवा जंगल तू धावर। जिन आदिवासियों को लोग अनपढ़ गंवार कहते हैं, उनको पर्यावरण का महत्व पता है, लेकिन पढ़े लिखे लोग जो पढ़ते हैं क्या, उनको क्यों नहीं लगता कि पेड़ बचने चाहिए, विकास। और मैं देख रहा हूँ कि हम लोग नहीं कर रुकने वाले। अगर मेट्रो होती है या फिर बुलेट ट्रेन होती है, उसके बाद हम रुकेंगे क्या? नहीं रुकेंगे। हम लोग जब तक इस पृथ्वी का सत्यानाश नहीं करेंगे सबको लेके। लेकिन और मुझे दुख इस बात का है कि विकास हम चाहते हैं, हम प्रगति चाहते हैं, पक्षी है, जो अन्य जीव है, उनका कोई भी दोष ना होते हुए भी वो भी मरेंगे हमारे साथ। तो हम मालिक नहीं है इस पृथ्वी के, हम लोग मालिक नहीं। सब बराबर का हिस्सा है, तो उनके बारे में सोच थोड़ा हमें अभी समझ लेना चाहिए। अभी जो एक बात ऐसी थी कि मेरे दादाजी वगैरह कोई साइंटिस्ट नहीं थे, लेकिन वो बता सकते थे कि बारिश 8 दिन में आने वाली है। जो पंछी घोंसले बनाते हैं पेड़ों के ऊपर, अगर उसने मजबूत बनाना शुरू किया तो लोग समझते थे कि इस बार बहुत सारी बारिश आने वाली है, बहुत सारे तूफान आने वाले हैं, तो पहले समझ लेते थे वो। तो हमें सावधानी से अभी सावधान होना चाहिए, नहीं तो हम लोग ये पैसा, ये जो प्रॉपर्टी, जो हम लोग विकास चाहते हैं, ये सब खत्म हो जाएगा। तो हमें विकास नहीं है, हम लोग बहुत जलद गति से विनाश की ओर जा रहे हैं। तो ये इशारा है बस।
Hi, I'm Shayu. I'm so sorry, but I don't have a question. It's a slight note in loose connection with the discussions that we were having today. So talking, as Malini ma'am said, that there is eco-sensitive zones right now. But while I was looking at the history of Goa, or the particular street, the Dayanand Bandorkar street, which is famous for the casinos right now, that is where the whole casinos in the Mandovi Basin are situated. So there was a lot of mining activity in the 1960s, 70s in Goa that was happening. And as Goa is that people stand in solidarity against whatever is happening. So they stood and they stopped mining, and mining was stopped. But now the GDP of Goa fell down, right? Now they were out of money. They did not have anything to earn. So then there were law amendments in the Gambling Act of Goa, and then the first casino was commissioned in the 1996, I think. And now we have 6 casinos in the river. So my point of bringing this to notice was that the issue of, or whatever we want to define that as, it still stayed. It just shifted from land to the water now. Now we still have issues, but it's in a different place right now. It's not where it used to be. And these casinos, I mean, they feed on, we feed on them, right? They feed on us. I mean, it's a two-way thing, right? So even we as tourists or as citizens, the choices that we make, the consume, I think even if we start being a little more aware of these things, I think the conversation then doesn't remain to the development plan and the boundaries, but then it boils down to us, right? So even the choices that we make. So I just wanted to make this note and thank you for the discussion. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for this comment, and I think it's again there's a value in it. Yeah.
Just want to respond to the whole concept of GDP. Mention the mining industry, right? For destroying the hill and extracting ore contributes to the GDP of Goa and the country. Ecological damage and the environmental damage costs are never brought into the equation. So please keep that in mind. GDP is not always a good. Sometimes it has very, very negative connotation.
Hello, my name is how much of a forest area can be claimed by a community and claim a forest area if it's rejected, and what are the consequences for a community if the claim is rejected?
So there are different types of rights one can claim under the Forest Act. As you said, you have individual forest rights and the other broad categories, community forest rights, and within that you have subcategory community resource rights. Forest rights, you have upper limit of 4 hectares. Maximum you can claim 4 hectares or areas which are under your for homestead land and agricultural land. But when it comes to community forest rights, one can claim anywhere irrespective of the classification of forest. So it is not limited only to. There is a lot of misinterpretation across the country that you cannot claim in tiger reserve area, you cannot claim in national. Irrespective of classification of forest, one can claim community forest rights, and you have good examples like the Soliga tribes in Karnataka claimed tiger reserve. You have a Melga tiger reserve in Maharashtra. So there are no sort of restrictions when it comes to one can claim. Only you need to prove that you were living or dependent on that land before 2005. Now when it comes to limitation, so for IFR you have limitation of 4 hectares, but there is no limitation for community forest rights. It varies from village to village. And we have some interesting examples coming from Chandrapur district of Maharashtra, where we have the highest forest cover is recognized under the community forest rights, and there is a village called Siddheswar village in Rajura Taluka of Chandrapur, 8,000 acres for the community CFR rights are recognized. And also there are no limitations whether what should be the limitation of household. And we have Gachiroli is one interesting example and one of the best where there was only one household claimed 300 acres of community forest rights. When it comes to community forest rights, if rights are not recognized, what are the consequences? So you have a process. So you have Gram Sabha level, you have HDLC, subdivision level, then you have a DLC. If this right is recognized, then it gets recognized at the DLC level. But if they are rejected at the DLC level, so Maharashtra you have another layer, especially PESA areas, special areas, where the governor of Maharashtra saying after DLC rejects, you can go to the commissioner level. But in other states, you don't have that option. Either you need to go to the High Court or Supreme Community. Groups have gone to High Court like Maharashtra, Tiger Reserve, where many community members have challenged the DL citizen. And same thing, you have several examples. Sapkosia Tiger Reserve in Odisha, where they have challenged the Supreme Court. So consequences are, if they are pending, there is traditional customer rights. But when the claims are pending, they cannot be evicted.
Are there any more questions?
Hi, my name is Aishwarya. Really interesting discussion. My question: you were talking about how we need to have a richer vocabulary to go beyond the compartmentalization of nature. So, could you just elaborate on that, because there's not able to.
Yeah, no, I mean, I kind of partially answered that question. The question is, how do you think about conservation or protection or valuation of ecological resources, ecosystem services, livelihoods, and everything that goes with. The point is that you can think about environment as something disconnected from the city, which needs to be protected, or you can think about urban nature, which includes a whole range of different values that come from different ecological and social interrelationships, right? So the challenge is to try to understand, map, identify, document, and come up with regulatory frameworks that recognize and provide different degrees of regulation and protection. You see, the problem that we have in general in our planning systems as a whole, not just when it comes to questions of the environment, is that we have extremely weak regulatory frameworks. We have very efficient policing, right? The problem is that. So you don't have any regulation when it comes to, let's say, real estate development, but and so the problem is urban services or public goods and so on. So you either have total protection or total liberalization, right? So it is. So when we're talking about urban nature, we need to think about, all right, how do you, like, take the CRZ example. It was there. It was provided differential levels of regulation for different areas. But you know what has happened to the CRZ rate, right? It's almost entirely. So this is essentially what one means when we say we need a new, richer framework to think about how to regulate urban nature, not just forest or not the forest.
Yeah, I think, I'd just like to add to this, frankly, because, for instance, I think Hussain spoke about the CRZ. For instance, in the Mumbai's development plan, if you see what is categorized, the recent development plan, or even in the 2014 version, what is categorized as a natural area. And that's exactly what Manani said, that it is it's those areas which are under the jurisdiction of the Forest Department, which is reserve forests, protected forests, national parks, sanctuaries. Those get categorized as natural area. And then there are the mangroves, again under the jurisdiction of the forest department, right? So those are categorized as natural area. So everything else, even the intertidal areas, the beaches, etc., is not categorized as natural area in the DP. So what we need is broader categories, and those categories were provided by, for instance, for the coast by the CRZ, because there were CRZ 1, 2, 3, 4, which categorized intertidal areas, even urban areas, open spaces as, areas which needed some kind of regulation. So these were regulatory frameworks which were not exclusive, like a forest. It doesn't need to exclude communities. Even urban areas can be protected through environmental zoning regulations. And similarly, for something like RA, you do have a category, because it's a buffer, it was categorized like an ESZ, right? Ecologically sensitive zone. So that is the legal protection for that. So the problem was that they had diluted the ESZ or ecologically sensitive for RA, and they had allowed activities like the metro car shed or the zoo and other uses to come up there, even resettlement housing. So all these are questions with planning and categories and how one regulates. And I think a question for us is how do we ensure that these regulations are not further dismantled? Because as of now, CRZ is dismantled. It's almost like, I think Debbie would be able to tell you more about it, but it's almost like gone. And even the forest buffer regulations are being kind of diluted. And the regulations that we had to protect whatever was there, whatever is left of Mumbai's environment are shrinking further and further. And what we are saying is it needs to expand rather than shrink, and therefore we need categories which are broader and more inclusive.
Would you like to comment? This RA thing has cropped up repeatedly in today's discussion. So just let me give you some background. On 12th December 1996, the Supreme Court passed an order saying the Forest Act would apply not just to forest land as per government records, but they brought in this concept of forest as per dictionary meaning of the word forest. The state government constituted committees for every district, and the chairman of the committee was the district collector. For Mumbai Suburban District, the forest officer, the DFO in charge of the National Park, was the member secretary, and the superintendent of land record was the third member of that committee. They defined large areas as minimum of 12 hectare size. This large can mean anything as per dictionary meaning. But for Maharashtra, they took it as 12 hectares and more. And as far as Mumbai Suburban District is concerned, I made a case for having RNU commonly declared as forest as per dictionary meaning. And off the record, the committee agreed with me. On the record, they said we can't do it because there's already too much pressure from politicians to protect who are eyeing the land in RA for various activities for us to notify this forest land. And we've seen the consequence of not having protected RA under the forest law at that point of time. Now, as far as CRZ is concerned, it's very interesting. In 1989, when we were drafting the CRZ notification, we put in the clause saying that areas that are vulnerable to flooding because of sea level rise should be kept free from all development activities. That was in 1989, when climate change and sea level rise was still. Today there is no dispute that climate change is happening, sea levels are rising. Yet in 2019, the CRZ notification for Mumbai has been relaxed. And instead of freezing the FSI or saying that there should be no construction, they have increased the permissible FSI within CRZ. Our own municipal commissioner is on record saying that 80% of Mumbai, South Mumbai will be underwater by the year 2050, right? And I asked him, I said, how come you are giving building permissions for areas that are going to be flooded, as per your own statement? And he had no answer. I said, why are you building the coastal road to service a part of the city which is going to be underwater? No answer. We have 10 or 11 metro projects under construction in the city of Mumbai currently. There's one underground metro and the rest are elevated. And guess what? The underground metro is being built in that part of the city which is going to go underwater. So it makes great planning sense and foresight on part of our planning agencies to do this kind of tamasha at our cost.
So I think this conversation can go, and then definitely this is not going to the end because even for this program, this is the third day and there are 5 more days to go. But as they say that all the good things come to end. So, but yes, informally everyone can be. The exhibition is there, so you should be there. And I would like to request Rohan to give a little jhalak about 5 days to come. thanks you for me.
Thank you, Simpreet. Thank you to everyone. Please around the Thank you all for coming and contributing to the conversation. Like Simpreet suggested, the conversation doesn't end today. The space is imagined as a conversation, as a clearing in the forest, where we will all come together in the evening and talk about some of the issues that have been raised today and some of the issues that are raised by the exhibition that is within which we are staging these conversations. I would suggest that after we finish from here, could you please spend some time, look at the exhibition, browse it. There's a lot to read. Some of these objects are really interesting and important for us to understand. There is another room where there's a map. There's a mapping the forest is what it's called. There are 3 ways of mapping that are there. So I would encourage you to please spend your time there. Like Simpreet said, the conversations don't end today. There are conversations that are also being staged here tomorrow and over the next few days. Tomorrow we have a conversation that we have termed Zameen, which looks at the idea of who has the right to be in the forest, or who does the forest belong to. And the day after that, we have a conversation that we have termed Jal, which looks at how infrastructure is accessed in the forest. And the forest here, of course, is an open-ended term. The next 3 days are also important. They are looking at practitioners who are working within the forest through cultural fields. We start off with a conversation around the idea of architecture and design, what role it can play in the forest. On Republic Day, which is the 26th, we have a day-long film festival that is being curated by the Adivasi Film Archive from the organization Bhasha. So it's a day-long looking at the role of images in narrative making. There's also a panel discussion among some of the filmmakers and artists who are involved in making these images. And on the last day, we have performances, music organizations, and also we have a theatrical production that was done as part of the project, as part of our research project, between Samyak, a local community youth group, and her organization Kali Billy Production. So it's a theatrical production that is happening. Musical performances and the release of a music video that was commissioned by the project. It was a collaboration between Prakash Goyal group and MC Mawali from the hip hop collective called Swadeshi, which is Bombay. Performance and some dancing in the forest. That's how we'll end this event, and that's what we are planning on doing. We'll let you go. I just have 3 small things actually. One is, please, there is a comment book at the back. We'd love to know events as well as the exhibition. So please, if you can spend a little bit of your time writing in that, it will help us. That you can use so you can get it directly on that. We also have a list outside. If you'd like to leave us your name, number, registration, we can get in touch with you concerning more events that we have. And lastly, I'd like to invite Sitaram, who has a gift and a memento for all the. So thank you all for coming. I hope you will come back more and more and get your friends and Panihak Samati on your Instagram posts, please. No.
Yeah, so thank you very much, all of you, on behalf of Panihak 72, and to please give a memento to Ankush. Akshata, please bring a memento to lay. Komal, I'd say, please give memento to Hussain. Mr. Henry Durwal. Again, Praveen to Shweta Vag. Akshita, Malini Krishna. Gitanjay Sahal, Komal. Prakash Dho. And Akshata to Simpreet bhai. Simpreet bhai. Yeah.
For valid.
If anyone wants to be shown